Thanks for tuning in. This episode is entitled It's All Too Much. And basically, we just discuss, are our spouses capable of carrying all of what we deal with, the good, the bad, the ups and downs, intimacy, any situation at all times?
With that said, make sure you hit us up on all the socials. Um, you can search Marriage is Tougher, find us on Facebook, Instagram. If you want to continue any of these conversations, we are looking for you and responding to everything on those channels. You can also find us on our website, marriageisttougher.com. If you'd like to post a question or request to be a guest, you can find a form there to do that. Outside of that, keep listening for the full conversation.
Is all too much. It's not expectations, but is it expectations? I don't know.
I, you know what? I think it is expectations. Well, it's a big part of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's like we need to manage our expectations, right? And so, just for the audience to explain what we mean by is all too much, I had this thought of all the things that my wife carries, right? Um, all of my bad stuff, right? Like if I come home from work, I wow, can't talk. I apologize. Had a bad day. Is she supposed to just allow me to dump all that on her and then like feel better and walk away? Right. Carry all of my good stuff, right? Um, like does she care about every little win I've had or every little success or all those things? Um, with that, all the ups and the downs of the relationship, um, you know, carrying the intimacy, specifically when maybe I'm in the mood and she's not, um, the parenting and just all of it all the time. Can we expect our wives to be all of those things all the time? Is where my mind was. And my initial thought is, well, yeah, isn't that what she signed up for? Right. But realistically, that can't be. I don't think anyone can be and or carry all of those things all of the time. Like I think we can have the expectation that they have all of those attributes, but carrying all of that all the time is going to run somebody into the ground and maybe even make them leave.
Yeah, it depends on how, if you haven't managed your expectations, how much you try to force them into being all or receiving all every time. And you
Mm.
don't, like you said, it's it's tough. So if you were to expect them to take every situation and do it flawlessly all the time and not give them, not just understand that they're human, so they're not going to, and then give them the grace to actively not do it even when you really need it. um yeah, that could definitely be grounds for like, okay, I'm out of here, you're not reading meeting my expectations. Like, wait, what? So
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's a dangerous place to not manage and or communicate your expectations.
Yeah. Do you find people have a all or nothing mentality when it comes to marriage?
That's a good question, because I'm thinking through the conversations, but generally when it gets to this point, I usually have a spiel about how it's not all or nothing.
Yes.
So I don't know if people change their, like, once they hear kind of the explanation, kind of like what we were just talking about, right? Once
Mhm.
you hear that, you're like, oh, like maybe maybe, yeah, that makes sense. So I would say probably if they haven't had the conversation, right? If you're
Okay.
thinking, if you haven't had the conversation, if you're going off of what different outlets that you consume say, you would assume that, because there is that myth out there that your spouse is your all, your spouse is your everything.
Mhm.
Um, and if that's the case, then it's in the fabric of you expecting them to be that without a conversation to be like, I can't be that. You know what I mean? Like, can you be that? And then
Right.
once someone says, can you be that? You're like, oh, no, I can't.
Yeah. And that's a good point to turn it around on yourself, right? Like, what do you want the expectations of you to be, right? Do you want to be able to make a mistake every once in a while? Do you want to be able to, drop a ball and not have it blow up your relationship? We are all human, and these things are to be expected, right? Even if you relate it to work, like, can I drop the ball once in a while? Like, obviously not make it consistent, but and if you make a mistake, learn from it, obviously improve. Um, but if you make a small mistake, do you lose your job over it? You feel me?
Right.
And you know, I think it, so. I know you listen to the Anthony O'Neill show, right? And he
Mm-hmm.
often has women on there, and he interviews them and asks them as he's searching for himself, like, what are you looking for, right? Who do these men need to be? And I find a lot of the women on there are like, oh yeah, he has to have this income, has to be doing this, has to love God, has to do this and that. And I'm like, man, that's a lot to ask for a relationship to start at,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, I'm all for people finding the person that they want and even knowing the person they want, but I often think to myself, like, is it all right if the man develops into that person or is on track to develop into that person? Right? Because it's I would say it's nearly impossible to find somebody who is all of the things and just ready to go. And like, I think we're such a instant gratification society, right? And we feel like, oh well, I've built myself into this person. But the problem is, like, maybe you're lacking in an area that your perfect man
Mm-hmm.
right, might want. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I think just remembering that we all have growth areas, right? Just like you just said that last point, we all have growth areas. So we can have desires that everyone is polished and all that, but it's really hard to get to those, especially if you don't know, right? Sometimes your spouse shows you an area that you need to grow in where you think you're good. Or you
Mm,
might be good, but you need to come up higher. And because you've been good so long, like you're just like, oh, that's fine. That's the good level. But no, like you need to be better. And your spouse will help you improve in that space. But yeah, so your my thoughts on that. Um, it's tough because the women on his show are usually in a different economic category than a lot of people.
that was the best
Um,
way to put it.
so if you're, you know, each step you go up, just like each step in your education, right? If you're looking someone to match your education as you go further up the chain, um, especially if you're looking for a specific minority group, it's
Mhm,
harder to find. One of my nephews, right? He's in higher ed, and he's he's in grad school, and we were talking about like how many people look like you. Like he's a young black man. Like he's like, not many. And I'm like, yeah, like so it's different levels when you're moving through, societal hierarchies to try to figure out that. So it's hard. But with all that aside, we have to know that maybe you say how many on the list are good, right? Like I need seven, 5 out of 7, right? And with the knowing after conversations that the person is working towards the other two. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I could get behind that. Because I feel like in a marriage, you should maintain a growth mindset.
mm-hmm.
You should always be willing to improve yourself and willing to receive that, like you said, from your spouse if they feel there's an area that you should improve on, as long as that information or communication is uh, done the right way, right? And by the right way, if I need to explain it, is like it's not necessarily like you need to do this or it's over, right? It's
Right.
like I, I need some help in these areas, or I would really like it if this would happen, or I think it would be best for our family if we could work together towards this, right? Those
Mm-hmm.
those types of words and conversations. Um, but I also think that it's okay to desire your entire checklist, right? You don't, like you said, you don't necessarily need to start off with everything, as long as you're willing to work towards it. And I also think that, like I said, it's okay to demand those for your relationship. And maybe I'm repeating myself, but it just needs to be done in the right way.
Yeah. I mean, having expectations are fine. Communicating expectations is almost more important than
Mm,
having expectations, right? Because if you don't communicate those, then the person never knows that you have these expectations.
right.
So then they're constantly falling short and feeling that from you. Even if you don't say anything, you can definitely feel that. Um, and if it's not, in the short term, it's over the long term, then it's like, oh, then it's almost like deception
Mm,
because you've never told them. Then whenever they do find out, it's like, oh my gosh, you've been expecting this for all this time, right?
yeah.
um but just coming out and saying it. And I think the way that we move from making it too much or making your spouse be all expecting all at all times is kind of teaching them how you would like them to support you in certain situations, right? So then they know, because they may have the expectation that they have to be at a certain place in certain situations, right? So if you had a bad day, they may feel like they have to, make everything perfect at home if you had a bad day at work. But you might just want to be able to dump it and leave it,
Mm,
right?
hmm.
Um, if something goes crazy with the kids, you may not just want them to hear it. You may want them to, hey, can you circle back around with them? And, I've already talked to them and affirmed that I still love them, but remind them, I'm their dad and that I love them and that we all make mistakes, right? So there may be different courses of action. And then once you do that, it may not seem, they'll actually meet your expectations and that will help you grow,
Hmm.
right? They may not always do it, but when you do, it's just one of those win things that you have as a couple. And now your marriage is stronger because you're seeing them hear your feedback, apply it, and then you're both growing. And then if those expectations change, like if it changes, okay, now I have a bad day at work. I would like it to be perfect at home. Not that I don't think that's what you need to do, but it could change
Right.
as you're in your marriage. And then once that happens, you just continue to grow um, as husband and wife.
I like that. I'm thinking now, I'm curious how in your counseling sessions you might broach that topic of expectations or like exposing expectations. And I think I'm most curious about, do you start that conversation with the couple's like backgrounds, like what their perceptions are first, and tackle that before you get to what expectations might be? Or
I it all depends, right? It's on, well, expectations. We talk about expectations with each topic that we cover,
okay.
right? But initially, when we're getting to know the couple or even have that, we talk about expectations pretty early, because that's vital. One, when you're doing coaching, um, but two, just in a relationship.
Hmm.
So we set those grounds hard, and we even use our experience and our example, right? Because we had a conversation early in our marriage, or maybe before we were even married. My wife was like, "No, I don't need you." And when you hear that, it can be very disheartening and even discouraging. But when you walk through that, you have to remember you two were separate before you got together, functioning people. You could go through life, whatever it was, job, house, car, whatever those things that you feel as necessities you were doing before you met this person.
Yeah.
So it's more of, I don't need you, but I want to do life with you.
Right.
I want you. I want those attributes that you have. I want you to hold me accountable. And when you shift that mindset, then it's like, oh, this person is not the end all be all, because I can function fully capable on my own, but I want to be with them and I'm choosing every day.
Yeah.
And when you hear that, because it always jolts them when they're like, "Ah, I don't need, you don't need me. Oh my goodness." But then it's like, oh yeah, like, because you have to think about it, what they're saying, and then flip it in reverse.
Hmm.
Then it's like, do I need them? Like, need to survive. Like, can I survive without them? Yes, but it's better with them.
Right.
Right? So, but when you look at it that way, and that usually jolts a conversation, and then we talk about just expectations, but also communicating through them. And how do you get through when people let you down?
Yeah.
And then when you take that to each topic that we cover in marriage, then it becomes easier and to dive deeper into what's expected and how to recover when those expectations aren't met.
Yeah. I think that's maybe a good place to finish is when your expectations are not met, right? So you've had all the discussions about what the expectations are, and like we said earlier, we are human, so we're going to fail at times. Um, what does that look like? What does grace look like? And what are some best practices to move forward past a failure in a specific expectation?
Yeah, I think depending on your situation, or as far as your relationship, how do you guys resolve conflict, or even when that failure happens?
Mm.
Are you guys in the moment, confrontation or confronters? Does it work better with one spouse when you circle back and say, in a couple minutes, or later that day, or if it happens late, maybe the next day, hey, you know, this is what happened. We talked about this expectation. This is what I thought was going to happen. It didn't. Um, and I think it's all about, like, not attacking the person, but being like, hey, that expectation wasn't met, and you usually do. So what was different about this time?
Mm.
Did I do something different that caused you to react different? Um, whatever the scenario, look for what factors were different, not what is the person different or a terrible person now.
Right.
Um, I think that's the best way to start the conversation. And then moving forward, that conversation usually tells what that outlier is. If your spouse is usually consistent on meeting the expectation, that specific expectation, there's probably an outlier that happened. Then you can address that and not really address the person.
That's good. That's real good. Um, I was thinking to myself as you were talking that I often talk on the show about how my tendency had been to avoid, right? And I think part of that was I wasn't ready to have conversations, so I needed, a lot of times just that cool down period or cool off period.
Hmm.
But I would let that fester and let it turn into even more avoidance. I have been working quite a bit on that, and now have uh, I want to say convinced myself or committed to broaching these difficult conversations and difficult situations a lot earlier. Not only because I've learned that it is now, in my opinion, the better way to handle things, now that I'm better prepared for it,
Hmm.
um, but specifically because my wife needed me to, right? It's how she was used to handling things, right? It was hurting her for me not to be able to speak on these things when she was ready to. Now, she has offered me quite a bit of grace over the time that we've been together, you know, um, 11 years that I've needed. Um,
Hmm.
but, like we've spoken about earlier in this episode, is when that grace is offered, don't take advantage of it. Be willing to improve upon the things that your spouse is asking of you, especially when they ask for it in an inappropriate way, and especially when it is something that can help sustain your marriage.